The Myth of Too Late, by David Russo. What if the biggest lie you've ever believed is that you're out of time? Every day, people quietly give up not because they lack talent, discipline, or desire, but because they think the clock has already beaten them. But what if success doesn't belong to the early? What if it belongs to the persistent? Have you ever looked at your life and quietly thought, I'm too late? Too late to change careers. Too late to chase something meaningful. Too late to become the person you once imagined you could be. It doesn't always come as a loud declaration. Most of the time, it's subtle. A passing thought when you see someone younger succeeding. A hesitation when you consider trying something new. A quiet voice that says, that window has closed. And so, without even realizing it, you begin to shrink your goals. You adjust your expectations. You stop reaching not because you don't want more, but because you've started to believe more isn't available to you anymore. But what if that belief is wrong? What if the idea of being too late isn't a fact, but a story you've been told and a story you've accepted? This audiobook about dismantling that story, because history and more importantly, real life is filled with people who didn't follow the timeline, people who didn't peak early, people who were overlooked, underestimated, or completely off track for years, until they weren't. You've heard some of these stories before. A man in his 60s building what would become KFC after facing rejection again and again. An athlete like Dennis Rodman who didn't even play organized basketball until later then. Mo Stan still became one of the greatest defenders the game has ever seen. These aren't just feel-good exceptions. They are proof of something deeper. There is no universal timeline for success. Some people start early and rise quickly. Others take longer, stumble more, and figure things out piece by piece. But the timing itself is not what determines the outcome. Persistence does. Adaptation does. The willingness to begin even when you feel behind does. And that's what this journey is about. Not pretending time doesn't matter, but understanding that it doesn't own you. Not ignoring doubt, but refusing to let it decide your future. Not wishing you had started sooner, but deciding that today is not too late. Because the truth is, the moment you stop moving forward isn't when you run out of time. It's when you decide you have. So, wherever you are right now, whether you feel behind, stuck, or uncertain, this is your reminder. Your story is not finished, and you are not too late. Chapter 1. The Lie of Too Late. The idea that it's too late doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly. It starts when you're young, watching timelines form around you. You see classmates succeed early. You hear phrases like by 30 you should, or if you haven't made it by now. And without realizing it, you begin measuring your life against a clock you never agreed to. At first, it feels like motivation. But over time, it becomes pressure. And eventually, it becomes permission to quit. Because once you believe there's a deadline on your potential, every passing year starts to feel like evidence against you. Every delay becomes a reason to hesitate. Every missed opportunity feels permanent. That's how the lie works. It doesn't scream at you, it quietly convinces you. It tells you that you've missed your window, that the people succeeding now got there because they started earlier, that whatever chance you had has already passed. And the most dangerous part, it feels logical. It sounds reasonable to say that time matters, that starting earlier gives you an advantage, that the world rewards youth, speed, and early momentum. But here's what that belief ignores. It confuses a head start with a guaranteed finish. Starting early can help, but it doesn't promise success. And starting late may slow you down, but it doesn't disqualify you. Because life isn't a straight line. It's unpredictable, messy, non-linear. People change, paths shift, skills develop at different speeds. And sometimes, the very experiences that make you feel behind are the ones preparing you to succeed in ways you couldn't have earlier. But when you believe the lie of too late, you stop seeing possibility. You stop before you even begin. You talk yourself out of trying, not because you lack ability, but because you've already decided the outcome. And that's the real cost. Not failure, not rejection, but inaction. Think about how many people never pursue what they truly want, not because they can't, but because they think they're past the point where it would matter. They don't apply. They don't create. They don't start. Not because the door is closed, but because they assume it is. And in doing so, they make the lie true. because the only time it actually becomes too late is when you stop moving forward. That's when growth ends. That's when possibility disappears. Not because of age, not because of timing, but because of belief. So before anything else, before strategies, before stories, before inspiration, you have to confront this one idea. What if you're not too late? What if the timeline you've been measuring yourself against was never real to begin with? Because if that's true, if even part of it is true, then everything changes. The hesitation, the doubt, the limits you've placed on yourself, they don't hold the same power anymore. And for the first time in a long time, starting becomes an option again. Chapter 2. The Power of Late Starts. There's a strange assumption we make about success. We assume that the earlier you begin, the better your chances. That time, above all else, is the deciding factor, and while there's some truth in that, time does matter. It's not the advantage most people think it is, because starting early gives you one thing, time, but starting later can give you something far more powerful, perspective. When you begin later in life, you don't arrive empty-handed. You bring experience, you bring failure, you bring lessons that early starters haven't had the chance to learn yet. You understand consequences better. You've made mistakes. You've seen what doesn't work. And while others may have a head start, you have clarity. And clarity changes everything. It allows you to focus faster, to avoid distractions, to commit in a way that isn't based on curiosity, but on decision. That's one of the hidden strengths of a late start. You're not experimenting with who you might be. You're choosing who you will be. There's less guessing, less drifting, less wasted motion, and that often leads to something early starters struggle with: consistency. Because when you start later, you're usually not chasing hype, you're chasing something real, something that matters to you on a deeper level, and that kind of motivation doesn't fade as easily. It's not built on excitement, it's built on urgency. You don't take time for granted in the same way. You don't assume you have endless years to figure it out. You show up with intention. You work with purpose. And over time, that compounds. Small, focused efforts repeated daily begin to close the gap between you and those who started before you. Then something interesting happens. The late start stops looking like a disadvantage and starts looking like a different path. Because while others may burn out, lose direction, or plateau early, you're just getting momentum. You're building with awareness. You're improving with intention. You're not rushing. You're refining. There's another advantage people rarely talk about: resilience. If you're starting later, chances are life hasn't been easy or straightforward. You've had setbacks, responsibilities, detours you didn't plan for. But those experiences build something invaluable: the ability to keep going when things get hard. Early success can be fragile. It can create pressure to maintain an image, to protect a reputation. But when you've already struggled, already failed, already had to rebuild, you're not afraid of starting small. You're not afraid of being uncomfortable. You've been there before, and that makes you harder to stop. So, while the world celebrates prodigies and early achievers, it often overlooks a powerful truth. Late starters are built differently. They move with intention. They act with purpose. And when they commit, they don't do it halfway. Because for them, it's not about keeping up. It's about finally stepping into something they've chosen. So, if you feel like you're starting behind, consider this. You're not beginning from zero. You're beginning from experience, from lessons, from a place of deeper understanding. And that might not make you faster out of the gate, but it can make you unstoppable in the long run. Chapter 3. The Colonel's Recipe for Persistence. By the time most people think about slowing down, he was just getting started. Colonel Harland Sanders wasn't a young man chasing a dream. He wasn't a rising entrepreneur with momentum on his side. In fact, by the time his most famous journey began, many would have considered his life ordinary at best and unsuccessful at worst. He had worked a long list of jobs, some stable, many not. He faced setbacks, business failures, and more than his share of closed doors. Nothing about his early path suggested that he would one day build something recognized around the world. And then, in his 60s, when most people are told to settle down, he decided to start over. Not because it was easy, not because the timing was perfect, but because he wasn't finished. With a simple fried chicken recipe and a belief that it was worth something, he set out to share it. But the world didn't immediately agree. He didn't get instant success. He didn't get lucky overnight. He got rejected. Again, and again, and again. Restaurants turned him down. People dismissed him. Doors closed in his face. It would have been completely reasonable expected, even for him to stop trying, to accept that maybe he had missed his moment. But he didn't, because he wasn't measuring his life by how much time had passed. He was measuring it by how much effort he was still willing to give. And that's the difference. Persistence ain't about never facing rejection. It's about refusing to let rejection define the ending. Eventually, that persistence turned into opportunity. His recipe was accepted, then shared, then expanded, and over time, what started as a late-life gamble became KFC, a name recognized across the globe. But the real story ain't about fried chicken. It's about what he refused to believe. He refused to believe that his age disqualified him. He refused to believe that his past failures determined his future. He refused to believe that it was too late. And because of that, he kept moving forward when most people would have stopped. That's the lesson. Not everyone will build a global business. Not everyone needs to. But everyone will face moments where it feels easier to quit than continue. Moments where rejection feels like proof that you should stop. And in those moments, the question isn't, how many times have I failed? The question is, am I done trying? Because as long as the answer is no, there is still a path forward. It may not be fast. It may not be easy. It may not look the way you imagined, but it exists. The Colonel's story reminds us that persistence doesn't have an age limit. It doesn't expire. It doesn't weaken just because time has passed. If anything, it becomes more powerful. Because when you choose to keep going later in life, you're not driven by pressure or expectation. You're driven by decision. And that kind of persistence, it's hard to stop. So, when you start to think it's too late, remember this. There was a man in his 60s, driving from place to place, hearing no more times than most people would tolerate, who kept going anyway. Not because he was guaranteed success, but because he refused to quit before it had a chance to happen. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Chapter 4. The Accidental Athlete. Some people are raised for greatness. They're identified early, trained young, coached, refined, and guided from the beginning. By the time they reach adulthood, they've already spent years, sometimes decades, developing their skills. And then there are those who find their path by accident. Dennis Rodman was not supposed to become one of the most dominant defensive players in basketball history. In fact, for much of his early life, basketball wasn't even part of the plan. He wasn't a highly recruited prodigy. He didn't grow up on a structured path to the professional level. By most standards, he was already behind. While others were competing, training, and building reputations, he was still figuring out where he fit. And then something unexpected happened. He grew literally and figuratively. A late growth spurt changed his physical presence, but that alone wasn't enough. Plenty of people grow taller. Very few turn that into excellence. What set him apart wasn't timing. It was commitment. Once he stepped into the game, he approached it differently. He didn't try to become the best scorer. He didn't chase the spotlight in the traditional way. Instead, he focused on the areas others overlooked: defense, rebounding, effort, the work that wasn't glamorous, the work that required discipline, the work that most people weren't willing to obsess over. And that's where he separated himself. Because when you start late, you often don't have the luxury of wasting time trying to be everything. You have to find your edge and lean into it completely. For him, that edge became relentless energy, precision, study, effort. He learned angles, timing, positioning. He studied the way the ball moved, the way players shot, the way rebounds fell. He turned what many saw as instinct into something intentional. And over time, that focus turned into dominance. Not because he had more years than anyone else, but because he made every year count. That's the hidden advantage of starting late. You don't take the opportunity for granted. You don't assume you'll figure it out later. You show up differently, with urgency, with purpose, with a willingness to do the work others avoid. And in many cases, that mindset can close the gap faster than people expect. Because success isn't always about who starts first. It's about who commits fully once they begin. Rodman didn't need a perfect timeline. He needed a starting point. And once he had it, he didn't hesitate. He didn't look back at lost time. He didn't compare himself endlessly to those who had started earlier. He focused on what he could control: effort, consistency, and growth. That's a lesson far beyond sports. Too many people hesitate to begin because they feel behind. They imagine others are too far ahead, too experienced, too established to catch. But what they don't see is how quickly things can change when focus replaces doubt, when action replaces hesitation, when you stop worrying about when you should have started and start maximizing where you are. Because the truth is, you don't need a perfect beginning. You need a decision, a moment where you stop waiting for the right time and start using the time you have. The accidental athlete isn't defined by when they began. They're defined by what they did once they finally did. And that's what makes their story powerful. Not that they were late, but that they didn't let being late stop them. Chapter 5. Mastery has no deadline. There's a belief that quietly limits more people than failure ever could. That there's a point where learning stops mattering. A point where growth slows down so much that trying no longer feels worth it. Where the gap between where you are and where you want to be feels too wide to close. And for many, that point gets labeled with a number: 30, 40, 50, as if the mind suddenly loses its ability to adapt, as if skill becomes locked, fixed, and unchangeable. But that belief doesn't come from reality. It comes from impatience, because mastery has never been about age. It's about repetition, focus, and time invested with intention. And those things don't disappear as you get older. If anything, they become more accessible. When you're younger, effort is often scattered. Attention is divided. Motivation rises and falls quickly. You try many things, but you don't always stay long enough to see meaningful progress. But later in life, something shifts. You become more selective, more deliberate. You don't just practice, you practice with purpose. And that changes the entire process. Because mastery isn't built on doing something occasionally. It's built on doing something consistently, correctly, and long enough for improvement to compound. That's true whether you're learning a physical skill, building a business, or refining a craft. The timeline doesn't define the outcome. The commitment does. Think about how many people abandon something simply because they're not immediately good at it. They expect progress to come quickly, and when it doesn't, they assume they've missed their chance. But mastery doesn't respond to urgency. It responds to persistence. It rewards those who are willing to be beginners longer than others are comfortable being beginners. And that's where most people fall away. Not because they can't improve, but because they don't want to struggle. They don't want to feel behind. They don't want to go through the phase where effort is high and results are low. But that phase is unavoidable for everyone. The only difference is whether you're willing to move through it. There are countless examples of people refining skills well into adulthood, people who didn't peak early, but continued to improve year after year through consistent discipline and repetition, because the body can adapt, the mind can learn, and skill can be built at any stage when the effort is applied consistently. The real obstacle isn't age, it's expectation. When you expect fast results, you become discouraged by slow progress. But when you understand that mastery is a long-term process, you begin to see progress differently. Small improvements start to matter. Consistency starts to feel like success. And over time, those small gains turn into something significant. So, instead of asking, "Am I too late to get good at this?" ask a better question. Am I willing to stay with this long enough to improve? Because if the answer is yes, then time is no longer your enemy. It becomes your greatest asset. Every day you continue is another layer added, another step forward, another piece of progress that didn't exist before. And eventually, what once felt impossible becomes natural, not because you started early, but because you refuse to stop. Chapter 6. Reinventing Yourself Midlife. At some point, many people arrive at a quiet but unsettling realization. The life they're living no longer feels like the life they want. Maybe the path once made perfect sense. It may have been responsible, logical, or necessary. It might have provided stability, income, or approval from others. But slowly, something changes. What once felt like forward movement begins to feel repetitive. What once felt safe begins to feel restrictive. And the thought of continuing this same trajectory for years, possibly decades becomes harder to accept. This is where reinvention begins, not from confidence, not from clarity, but from awareness. The recognition that staying where you are could be the bigger risk. The difficulty is this: the longer you've stayed on one path, the heavier it feels to step away from it. You've poured in time, effort, identity. At some point, it's no longer just what you do, it becomes who you are. And leaving it behind can feel like losing a piece of yourself. That's why people remain where they are, not because they're satisfied, but because they feel tied to an outdated version of themselves. They convince themselves it's too late, that changing direction would undo everything they've built. But reinvention isn't about wiping the slate clean. It's about growth. You don't discard your past. When you evolve, you bring it with you. Every experience, every lesson, every failure becomes part of your advantage. Often, those very things are what make success in a new direction possible. There are many examples of this. Dwayne Johnson built his early identity in wrestling before transitioning into acting and becoming a global icon. Julia Child didn't begin her cooking journey until her late 30s and went on to influence how generations approach food. These examples stand out because they're visible. What goes unnoticed are the countless quieter reinventions happening every day. People shifting careers, learning new skills, starting over, or reconnecting with passions they once left behind. They may not become famous, but many of them become fulfilled, and that's what truly matters. Reinvention doesn't require a dramatic overnight transformation. It doesn't mean abandoning everything all at once. Sometimes it begins subtly: a new habit, a new skill, a small shift explored alongside your current life. What matters most is the decision. The moment you choose to say, "This isn't where my story stops," because you are allowed to change. You are allowed to outgrow who you used to be. You are allowed to become someone different even if others don't understand it. And yes, it won't feel easy. You'll doubt yourself. Others may question your choices. At times, the old path will seem more appealing simply because it's familiar. But familiar isn't always right. Growth often demands stepping into uncertainty, trading comfort for possibility. And when you do, something shifts. You realize your life isn't fixed. It's adaptable. It's still unfolding. Reinventing yourself in midlife ain't evidence that you're behind. It's proof that you're aware, that you're willing to adjust, that you refuse to settle for a life that no longer fits. In a world where many stay stuck out of fear, that willingness alone sets you apart, because it means one simple thing: you're still moving forward. Chapter 7. The courage to begin badly. Very few things hold people back as much as the fear of looking foolish. Not failure itself, not time constraints, not even lack of opportunity. It's the idea of starting something and not being good at it, of being seen while you're still figuring things out, of being a beginner in a world that rewards mastery. So people delay. They wait until they feel ready, until they've learned enough, until they feel confident enough to avoid embarrassment. But waiting for readiness can become a trap, because confidence doesn't come before action, it grows after repetition. And repetition only starts when you're willing to be bad at something long enough to improve. Every skill you admire once looked unimpressive. Every expert was once awkward. Every master once felt unsure. But those early phases are rarely visible. They aren't shared, celebrated, or remembered the same way as the final result. So, what we see is the outcome, not the process, and that creates the illusion that we're supposed to start strong. But starting strong is uncommon. Starting at all is what matters. The beginning of anything worthwhile is often uncomfortable. You feel slow, inefficient, out of place. You compare yourself to people far ahead and assume you don't belong. That assumption becomes an easy way out. You tell yourself, maybe this isn't for me. But more often, what you're experiencing is simply the early stage of learning, not a lack of ability, just a lack of experience. And experience can be built. The people who eventually succeed aren't the ones who avoided that stage, they're the ones who stayed in it long enough to move through it. They allowed themselves to be beginners. They accepted that progress takes time. They understood that embarrassment isn't a signal to stop, it's proof that they've started. Think about how many things you avoid because you might not be good at them immediately. Writing, speaking, creating, building, learning something new. Avoidance feels safe, but it comes with a cost. Because every time you delay starting, you delay growth. And over time, that avoidance shapes a life driven more by fear of judgment than by actual limitations. But something changes when you choose to begin anyway. When you accept that your first attempt may be messy, that your early efforts may fall short, that you might not yet recognize yourself in what you create. That's where courage appears, not in perfection, but in participation. At some point, everyone who grows faces a moment where they realize they will never feel fully ready and must act regardless. That moment is the gateway to progress, because once you start badly and realize you're still okay, you loosen fear's grip. You see that imperfection didn't ruin you, that judgment didn't stop you, that starting small didn't trap you. It simply got you moving, and from there, everything opens up, not because you're suddenly excellent, but because you've finally begun. So, if there's something you've been postponing while waiting to feel ready, consider this. Readiness isn't required to start. It's built through starting, and the willingness to begin badly may be one of the most important skills you ever develop because it's what makes every other skill possible. Chapter 8. Time isn't a lie, not an enemy. Most people think of time as something they're losing, a countdown, a shrinking window, a silent pressure that grows louder with every passing year. And when you believe time is working against you, everything feels urgent in the worst way. You rush decisions. You compare yourself to others. You measure your life in what you haven't done, yet instead of what you're building now. But time doesn't actually behave like that. Time doesn't compete with you. It compounds with you. The same years that can make someone feel late are also the exact years that build skill, depth, resilience, and understanding if you choose to use them. That's the part most people miss. They think success is about arriving quickly, but in reality, it's about what accumulates while you keep going. Think about any meaningful ability: writing, business, fitness, communication, leadership, creativity. None of these are built in a moment. They are built through repetition over time, and time, when paired with action, becomes powerful. A single day of effort doesn't look like much, but a year of effort changes everything. 5 years of consistent effort can completely transform a life. And yet, people often discount time instead of using it. They say, "I'm already behind," so they slow down. They say, "I should have started earlier," so they hesitate. They say, "It'll take too long," so they never begin. But the irony is this: the moment you stop acting is the moment time truly starts working against you. Because time doesn't reward intention, it rewards repetition. Look closely at people who seem to have arrived late. What you usually find is not wasted time, but invisible preparation. Skills learned in unrelated jobs, life experience gained through failure, emotional maturity built through difficulty. Even detours that once felt like setbacks often become the foundation for something greater. Nothing is truly wasted if you learn from it. And when you stop seeing your past as lost time, you begin to see it as training. Every delay becomes development. Every mistake becomes information. Every difficult season becomes part of your toolkit. That shift in perspective changes everything, because now, instead of racing against time, you start working with it. You stop trying to catch up and start trying to build forward. And that's where momentum begins. Time becomes less of a threat and more of a partner. It gives you space to improve, space to experiment, space to refine what you're doing without needing immediate perfection. And if you stay consistent long enough, something powerful happens. What once felt like a disadvantage begins to look like depth. You are no longer someone who rushed in blindly. You are someone who developed deliberately. There's another truth here that often gets overlooked. Time is going to pass anyway. You don't get to stop it. You don't get to pause your life until you feel ready. You only get to decide what happens while it passes. And that decision determines everything, because 5 years will still become 5 years. The only question is whether those 5 years build something, or maintain hesitation. So, instead of asking, "Is it too late?" a better question is, "What can I build if I start now and give time something to work with?" Because time isn't the enemy. It's the force that turns effort into progress. And once you begin to see it that way, you stop fearing the clock and start using it. Chapter 9. Quiet persistence versus loud talent. The world tends to celebrate what it can see. The breakout success, the overnight story, the naturally gifted performer who makes everything look effortless from the beginning. These are the stories that get attention because they are easy to recognize, easy to admire, and easy to share. But what the world often overlooks is something far less visible and far more powerful: quiet persistence, the kind of effort that doesn't announce itself, the kind of progress that happens when no one is watching, the kind of discipline that doesn't need applause to continue, because behind almost every sudden success, there is usually a long period of unseen repetition, days, months, sometimes years of showing up without recognition, of improving in silence, of continuing when results are not yet visible. And that's where the real separation happens. Talent can open a door quickly, it can create early momentum, it can make things look easy in the beginning, but talent alone is not stable. It needs direction, it needs discipline, and without persistence, it often fades before it fully matures. Quiet persistence, on the other hand, builds differently. It doesn't rely on early validation. It doesn't need immediate proof. It simply continues, even when progress is slow, even when no one notices, even when it feels like nothing is changing. And over time, that consistency becomes something powerful. Inevitability, because repetition has a way of reshaping ability. What once felt difficult becomes familiar. What once felt unfamiliar becomes natural. And what once looked impossible begins to feel manageable. This is where many people underestimate themselves. They assume that if progress isn't fast, it isn't happening. But growth is rarely dramatic in the moment. It's subtle, incremental, easy to miss day by day, but undeniable when you look back over time. The challenge is that persistence doesn't feel exciting. It doesn't always feel rewarding in the moment. There are no instant signals that say, "This is working." So people compare themselves to louder stories, to faster timelines, to visible success, and in doing so, they begin to doubt their own quieter progress. But doubt is often a misunderstanding of timing. What feels like stagnation is usually accumulation. What feels like delay is often development. And what feels invisible is often the foundation, being built beneath everything else. There's a reason long-term success tends to favor those who keep going rather than those who start strong, because strong starts are common. Sustained effort is not. Anyone can begin with energy. Few continue when energy fades. Anyone can perform when motivation is high. Few perform when motivation disappears. But persistence doesn't depend on motivation in the same way. It becomes a habit, a rhythm, a decision repeated so many times it stops feeling optional. That's why quiet persistence often outlasts loud talent. Not because talent is weak, but because consistency is stronger than intensity. Over time, the person who keeps showing up begins to close gaps that once looked too wide. The difference between them and others shrinks not because they moved faster, but because they never stopped moving. And eventually, something shifts. What was once potential becomes skill. What was once effort becomes mastery. What was once quiet becomes undeniable. So, if your progress feels slow, or invisible, or unrecognized, it's worth remembering this. The loudest success is not always the strongest foundation, and the strongest foundation is often built in silence, because in the long run, it is not the loudest start that determines the outcome. It is the persistence that refuses to stop. Chapter 10, Your Second Timeline. There comes a point in life when you realize something quietly powerful. You are no longer living on the timeline you once imagined. Maybe you thought you'd be further ahead by now. Maybe you expected different results, a different career, a different version of yourself. At some point, most people build an invisible schedule for their life milestones. They believe they should hit, ages they believe things should happen by, expectations they rarely speak out loud. And when reality doesn't match that timeline, it's easy to assume something went wrong. But what if nothing went wrong? What if you're simply on a different timeline now? Not a worse one, not a delayed one, just a second one. Because life doesn't actually move in a straight, predictable script. It branches, it shifts, it responds to decisions, circumstances, setbacks, and discoveries you couldn't have fully planned for in advance. The first timeline is the one you imagined when you didn't. yet know what life would demand of you. The second timeline is the one you build after experience has reshaped your understanding of what matters, and that second timeline often begins quietly. It starts when you realize you can no longer measure your life fairly against people who took different paths, people who started earlier, people who had different opportunities, people who didn't face the same detours or delays. Comparison makes the second timeline feel like a setback, but perspective turns it into something else entirely, because your second timeline is not defined by what you missed, it's defined by what you decide next. This is where many people unknowingly give up, not because they are incapable, but because they keep trying to live inside a timeline that no longer fits them. They keep measuring progress against a version of life that never accounted for change. But once you accept that you are not behind in a universal race, once you step out of that comparison entirely, something shifts. You begin to see possibility again. You stop asking, "Why am I not where I should be?" and start asking, "What can I still build from here?" And that question is far more powerful, because it puts you back in control. Your second timeline is not limited by age. It is not defined by past mistakes. It is not restricted by earlier outcomes. It is shaped by what you choose to do with the time you still have. And that time, no matter how much has passed, is still active, still usable, still capable of producing change. The people who thrive in their second timeline are not the ones who had perfect beginnings. They are the ones who accepted that beginnings can happen more than once. They restart, they redirect, they rebuild, not because they failed the first time, but because they understood that life allows multiple entries into growth. There is something freeing about this realization. It removes the pressure to catch up and replaces it with the freedom to build differently, more intentionally, more honestly, more aligned with who you are now, not who you were when you first started. And in that space, growth becomes lighter, not because it's easier, but because it's no longer driven by regret. It's driven by direction. So, if you feel like you're behind, or off schedule, or not where you thought you would be, consider this. You may not be on your first timeline anymore. You may be on your second, and second timelines are not where stories end. They are where new ones begin. Conclusion: you are still in the story. At some point, almost everyone asks the same quiet question: is it too late for me? It doesn't always come with panic. Sometimes it comes with exhaustion. Sometimes with disappointment. Sometimes just a numb acceptance that life didn't unfold the way it was supposed to. But beneath that question is something deeper. Not a lack of ability, not a lack of opportunity, but a loss of belief that change is still possible. This audiobook was never about famous names or extraordinary exceptions. It was never about proving that success is easy or guaranteed at any age. It was about something simpler and far more important. The idea that your story is not fixed, because the belief that it's too late is rarely about time itself. It's about meaning. It's about what you think your past says about your future. It's about whether you believe your best chapters are already behind you. But nothing in life actually confirms that. Time keeps moving. Yes, but it doesn't decide what you do with it. And that distinction changes everything. You've seen how people start late and still rise. How skill can be built later in life. How reinvention is possible. How persistence compounds quietly over time. None of these ideas require perfection. They only require continuation. Because the truth is, most lives don't fall apart from lack of talent or opportunity. They stall from stopping too soon, from believing the pause is permanent, from deciding, often quietly, that the effort is no longer worth it. But as long as you are still willing to try, the ending has not been written. You are not reading a finished story. You are living a continuing one. And continuing means possibility still exists, no matter how long the silence has been, no matter how many detours you've taken, no matter how far behind you feel. There is no single moment where life declares, your chance has passed. There is only the moment you decide to stop writing. Everything before that is still open, still changeable, still yours. So, if you take anything from these stories, let it be this: you are not late. You are not behind. You are not disqualified from becoming more than you are today. You are simply in a chapter that hasn't finished yet, and the next line of your story does not depend on where you started, It depends on whether you choose to continue, because as long as you do, you are still in the story.